The test cell hissed like a live throat of the earth. Night lay heavy on the hills outside the plant, but inside the concrete vault, the air shimmered with heat. Sparks leaped from a grinder and drifted like embers from some great kiln. A mechanic's gloved hand rested on the flank of the fighter's engine as if to steady a heartbeat. Every bolt, every rivet felt to him like a promise or a threat. The machine in the room, twin engine, long-nosed, a heavy fighter built to carry men, fuel, guns, and a terrible intention, filled the space with vibration even when still. If you want to stay until the end and follow how a hidden factory learned to make that machine fly true, subscribe and leave a like. Stories this large take time, and there are more like this to come. Heinrich Bauer had been awake since dusk. He smelled of oil and hot metal, the odor braided with coffee and the dry, stale paper of printed orders. As one of the senior fitters, he moved with the slow efficiency of men who have repeated the same motions until the motion itself teaches them where to place their feet. He had lived 3 winters under the factory roof since his brother stopped returning from the front. He slept on a cot behind the tool racks and kept a small notebook under his pillow where he wrote the dates he missed home, as if writing them might stitch them back together. At the center of that night's attention was the BF 110's right engine, a Daimler-Benz unit, compact and proud, its cowling polished until fingerprints marked like moons across the metal. It had scorched itself in a previous run, its cylinder head temperatures spiking despite the mechanic's careful shimming and the bench-tested pump they had fitted from a lorry motor. The problem had been a hairline fracture in an oil gallery that could not be seen until pressure rose to the point of shudder. Finding it had required ingenuity and stubbornness in equal measure. A stethoscope pressed to the crankcase, the slow pouring of a cold dye, the mapping of thermal gradients on a night when the thermocouple itself seemed to have a mood. Eric Brandt, the factory's head metallurgist, stood with his palms tucked deep into the pockets of his workshop coat, watching the instrument bank like a guardian. He was 40, gaunt in the face from long hours and a worry that had come to live in the lines at the corners of his mouth. He had been trained in the city university, but came to this plant because the work called and because his father had been a machinist before him. Men in the factory spoke of him in tones that mixed respect and something like affection. He reads metal the way a reader reads a text, and when he spoke about an alloy, it was as if he were translating a rusted dialect into something intelligible. "A small rise in pressure when it warms," he said quietly, more to himself than to the men around him. "We must rework the seal tolerances. If we tighten the pump housing, the oil path shifts. If we leave it the same, the cylinder head will lip and the compression will—" His voice drifted off. He preferred the metal to speak back. Outside the vault, the rest of the plant slept in the dim hush of wartime schedules, though sleep in such places was often the brief closing of a single eye between long watches. Production had been dispersed in haste after the early raids on assembly sites. The plant beneath the Franconian Ridge had been built in secret, a patchwork of timbered sheds and reinforced cellars, employing craftsmen from towns whose names men had been told not to say aloud. It was not on any tourist map. The trains that served it ran at odd hours and brought in raw materials under the lock and key of military passbooks.
Women worked on the final lines beside men who had kept their hands on tools since the 20s. Their hands were different from engineers' hands. Smaller, quick, capable of subtle motions that eased rivets into place or coaxed canvas into a canopy. They worked because there was work to do, and because the world outside had placed every man under the yoke of some other duty. The BF-110 arrived at that plant in components, wings, fuselage sections, engine blocks, some stamped in legitimate factories, others salvaged from damaged machines and reworked until they were duly useful. Building them required solving a constellation of small problems that piled up into large ones. The tailplane's harmonic tendencies under heavy throttle, the cowling flares that affected cooling flow, and the weight paradox. Each added armor plate or extra radio pushed the center of gravity aft and demanded retuning of elevator ranges. In the early war years, the BF-110 had been designed for long-range escort and heavy fire, but as conflict sharpened, its role altered. Where once it escorted bombers, it became a night fighter and intruder, fitted with radar, with guidance boxes that hummed and required their own cooling ducts. In the forge, under the hum of lamps and the pulse of machines, Brandt kept a logbook. He wrote entries with measured handwriting, sometimes in cipher. The logbook was not an overt manifesto of conscience. It recorded alloys tried and temperatures reached, the date, the serial numbers of engines that had survived the run. But threaded through the technical entries, there were lines that read like letters. On the 14th, Hans brought a photo of his boy. He says he will take the next furlough. I told him to wait. The lead in the piston alloy held at 520 degrees. We saw less scuff. That small domestic tenderness anchored the work. It reminded every man and woman who read those pages that what they built carried human faces into the sky. Samuel Ortlieb was 22, a welder with a lopsided smile and a habit of asking questions that stopped people in the middle of sentences.
One afternoon, leaning against a crate of propeller screws, he asked Brandt, voice half in curiosity, half in mischief, "If the metal is like a language, what does the engine want to say to us today?" It was the kind of question that made older men snort, but Brandt paused and looked at the boy as if he had been offered a new specimen to examine. "It says," Brandt answered slowly, "that we must listen before we force it. The shape of the cooling passage is like a sentence. If you force your words, you confuse the meaning." The answer became a small legend in the workshop. Listen to metal before you boss it. Not every story in the plant had a quiet, metaphoric arc. There was the afternoon Robert Kane lost part of a finger to a lathe that caught his sleeve when he misjudged the guard. The sound in the workshop, the metallic snick, and then Robert's sharp intake compressed the day into a sober hour. They patched his hand in the infirmary while a foreman read the accident report with a face like a slate. The injury did not stop Robert from returning when his stitches were taken out, but it changed him. He moved with a more exact caution and found himself afraid of nothing except the thought that one wrong moment could erase his future. The plant's bulletin board took on a new gravity. Safety posters, once glossed over, became a creed to recite between rivet runs. Those small human vignettes threaded into a larger pattern. The machine's technical obstinacy tested patience and ingenuity, while the grinding calendar of war pressured speed.
Military representatives came with their clipped uniforms and lists of demands. Colonel Weiss, a compact man with a jaw like a clamp, visited the plant 3 times that winter. He would stand in the test cell doorway, arms crossed, and ask for operational readiness. For him, readiness meant numbers, flight hours, sortie counts, reliable gun sights. For Brandt and his crew, readiness sometimes meant a sleepless night spent reflowing a cooling duct and discovering a defect only visible under a certain light. The answer became a small legend in the workshop. Listen to metal before you boss it. Not every story in the plant had a quiet, metaphoric arc. There was the afternoon Robert Kane lost part of a finger to a lathe that caught his sleeve when he misjudged the guard. The sound in the workshop, the metallic snick, and then Robert's sharp intake compressed the day into a sober hour. They patched his hand in the infirmary while a foreman read the accident report with a face like a slate. The injury did not stop Robert from returning when his stitches were taken out, but it changed him. He moved with a more exact caution and found himself afraid of nothing except the thought that one wrong moment could erase his future. The plant's bulletin board took on a new gravity. Safety posters, once glossed over, became a creed to recite between rivet runs.
They watched thermal tapes like detectives studying a crime scene. When an engine failed 3/4 of the way through a scheduled endurance run, they did not have time for despair. They had to take the engine apart on the spot, strip it down to the crank and bearings, and find where the material had betrayed them. Often, the betrayal was a subtle misalloying in one batch of steel, a supplier's error in quenching that made a bearing race brittle beyond a safe threshold. That brittle race would, under load, shatter into filings that would feed into a pump and trip catastrophic seizure. Brandt argued for greater oversight of suppliers. He drafted a specification sheet that read like a temperamental diary: ideal tensile strengths, expected fatigue cycles, a mandatory additional sampling for every 1,000 produced. He was accused by procurement officers of being slow and by the colonel's aide of being fussy. But a single bearing failure on a test bench could save lives if it was caught before flight. For an engineer in a production plant, fussy was a synonym for tactician in reserve. When the team finally coaxed a run that stayed within green margins, 4 hours of steady output at rated power, temperature stable, vibration harmonics damped, the vault held its breath. That night, the gauges read a clean line like a horizon. Someone who had been at the bench since before midnight lay down on a bench and wept silently, not because of victory, but because the machine had, in that quiet way, shown them that their work mattered beyond the immediate. The engine's output sounded like a chorus relieved to find the right cadence. But technical success in a factory is only ever a prelude to another question: what will the machine be used for? The BF-110, with its bulky frame and range, was deployed in roles that shifted with the theater's needs. It escorted bombers in daylight, it patrolled the night skies, and it interdict enemy bombers when radar-guided interceptions were possible. With the addition of airborne intercept radar in late '43, crews in the BF-110s became a different kind of hunter, guided by instruments that were as much a part of the aircraft as engine and airframe. Installing those suites required carving space in the nose, reinforcing mounts, and rerouting magnetic wiring so that the transmitter's hum did not drown out the engine's own song. There were moral conversations in the canteens, whispered between bites and folded bread.
Not all men voiced them aloud. Some argued that they were craftsmen doing a job. Some said they simply wanted to keep the plant from being repurposed as a munitions dump. In one quiet corner, a woman named Marta, who had welded wing spars for 3 years, passed a letter to Brandt from a cousin evacuated from a bombed city. The cousin's words were raw. The roof's gone, the market's gone, and no one to pick up the sewing that had been their livelihood.
Martha folded the letter back into its envelope and said nothing, but her hands trembled. "We build these planes so our boys will not be killed," she murmured into the steam of her coffee. "And then they fly them to destroy other houses." Brandt listened and said only, "We ask the metal to be honest with us. We must ask the same of ourselves." The plant's administrators had little appetite for ethical quandaries. Schedules had to be met. A single missed quota could trigger a transfer of tooling to another site, or worse, the arrival of forced labor on terms no one in the office wanted to imagine. The machine of wartime bureaucracy turned with the same inexorable logic as the machines on the floor. When the first field send-off happened, it had the furtive air of one of those unmarked transports winding through the pre-dawn mist. A flight crew came to the plant to collect the assembled aircraft, checking serial numbers and signatures. Lieutenant Franz Keller, reserved with a pilot's narrow face, accepted the logbooks with a gravity that suggested he understood both the machine's vulnerability and its purpose. He was young enough to hope for glory, old enough to know how much depended on the metal's truth. At takeoff, the sound of the BF-110s rolling down the dispersal runway was like a distant storm. The men in the plant watched until the silhouette merged with the low clouds. The engineers stood near the control tower and compared readings of the flight data radio. They argued lightly about trim settings and suggested adjustments. "Gentle at 500 meters," Brandt told the lieutenant. "Expect to trim 2 clicks starboard with the radios aboard." The pilot nodded, a short, mechanical motion that concealed private anxieties. No one spoke of what missions the aircraft would fly. That was a new kind of silence. On an overcast night a month later, the telephone rang in the workshop. A brief message. The aircraft had returned after a nighttime interception, had damaged a bomber before it was itself engaged and forced to land. The logbook came back with notes scrawled across the flight sheet. An overheating cylinder at 15 minutes into the intercept, a flicker in the transmitter. The crew had managed to nurse the machine home. The notes read like a report and like a love letter. Engine 2 ran hot, cowl flaps at 60%. Adjustments recommended to baffle H3. Radio knocked out by heavy flak at 2310. Crew safe. The men who had touched that aircraft read the notes and, in the margins of the ledger, added their own gleanings. Little triumphs and failings side by side. These cycles repeated and widened. As production scaled from dozens to hundreds at the plant's extended lines, the human stories multiplied. Recruits trained on the bench and assigned to flight crews. A mother who worked nights bending metal while her boy learned to read maps in a corner. A foreman who bore the news of casualties with a quiet that suggested the weight had hollowed him. The factory itself acquired star tissue. A scarred press here, a nicked crane hook there.
The building began to feel like an organism that remembered pain and exertion. Yet, with greater output came a sharper ethical glare. The BF-110's very adaptability meant it could be equipped for longer-range patrols, for forced intrusions, for the tactical interdiction of cities when military necessity deemed it required. Reports trickled through from the front. Entire neighborhoods burned in nights of bombing. Civilian tolls that read like paragraphs of a ledger. On one Friday, when rain tapped the corrugated roofs, Brandt found himself rereading a dispatch that summarized an operation he knew some of their aircraft had supported. He closed his logbook and pressed his fingers into his eyes as if to stop the image. He had built mechanisms of flight that now carried men into actions that would scar the landscape. At the same time, there were pragmatic realities. For crews in the field, improved engine reliability meant fewer forced landings, fewer nights spent trying to hide from patrols in hedgerows. A faster climb rate saved a crew from being caught by enemy fighters. A rebalanced center of gravity prevented a stall that might have killed a navigator before the machine hit the ground. The engineers, in their quiet, believed they served the preservation of lives as much as they served military aims. That belief was complicated and sometimes unsteady, an uneasy reconciliation between tradecraft and consequence. The breakthrough that the plant truly needed came not in a single brilliant flash, but as the slow accumulation of many small, convergent discoveries. A new baffle geometry redistributing cooling flow, paired with a revised mixture control valve, stabilized head temperatures in a manner that previous assemblies had only hinted at. It would be imprecise to call it a miracle. It was, more truthfully, the result of patient iteration, test after test. An alloy here hardened at a slightly different quench, a pump housing given an extra thousandth of an inch, a radiator flap reseated to alter turbulence. When the scaled tests showed endurance and repeatability, the plant shifted from experiment to reliable production. That first sustained run that matched specifications and returned a durable airframe to the shelf felt like an ending and a beginning. Men at the bench cheered in the way tradesmen do, a small, astonished clapping that was half relief and half gratitude. They did not celebrate the machine's mission. They celebrated the refusal of the materials to betray them that night.
Still, the machine would soon depart the plant in greater numbers, move into squadrons, and be adapted to missions defined far from the thought of the men who had shaped its bearings. Tactically, the BF-110's usefulness shifted as its crews innovated. Night fighters equipped with radar proved deadly in the dark corridors over enemy airspace. Their operators learned to trust instruments and their co-pilots more than the stars. The plant's radios and mounts proved reliable. The gun harmonization remained true on most flights. To the men in the factory, those operational successes were measured in returns and in fewer casualty lists. To philosophers and to men like Marta, they were measured against the map of ruins that arrived at the canteen table in whisper. War, when recounted as a series of technical achievements, can read as a ledger of progress. When seen as the sum of human acts, it is a tapestry threaded with choices. The plant's workers bore that weight. Many of them would not live to see peace. Others would survive, carry scarring and pride in equal measure, and return to their towns not as heroes, but as tired citizens. The factory itself would, after the conflict, change hands, be repurposed, the jigs and fixtures hauled away, while the concrete shell remained like a raised eyebrow in the countryside. For Brandt, the work remained defined by materials and by conscience. He kept writing in his logbook, and, occasionally, he used that private ledger to collect small moral reckonings. A note on December frost when a crewman had slept in the workshop to finish adjustments. An entry in the spring about a child's drawing discovered on a bench top. An annotation beside an engine serial number that had failed after a bombing run and shredded its own pistons. Those human annotations transformed the logbook from a dry technical document into a palimpsest of the people who made it. It was not possible in the plant's world to separate the artisanship from the politics. Men in uniform came and went. New directives arrived with the seasons, sometimes altering priorities overnight. Equipment that once seemed optional, a reinforced mount, a spare carburetor, became mandatory as tactics evolved. The plant adapted, as plants do, like living systems adjusting to a harsh environment. In doing so, it produced machines that could be used for protection and machines used in destructive missions. The difference lay not in the metal, but in choice. As the war's arc lengthened and the distance between the plant's workbench and the front narrowed in human terms, a new, quieter task began to occupy men's minds: the prospect of what would remain when the machines fell silent. They spoke of a museum in an unknown future, of an aircraft hung from wires as if to be admired for its engineering alone. They imagined, in fleeting, almost guilty wonder, a child's hand tracing the rivet line where a worker's thumb had once rested. It was a small dream, but a human one, to be remembered as builders, not merely as instruments of a broader violence. On a late night in the spring, after a long day of fitting radar housings and adjusting gun mounts for the new night fighter conversions, Brandt closed his logbook and walked to the vault's outer door. He placed his hand on the cold metal of the nearest crankcase and felt the echo of every hand that had worked on that engine. He thought of Marta's letter, of Robert's bandaged hand, of Samuel's questions. He thought of the men in the sky who would trust them. He did not have an answer to whether the work was good or necessary. He had only the stubborn conviction that the craft itself demanded honesty, that a bolt must be torqued to the right value, that a bearing must never be allowed to run hot, that a rivet must sit squarely in its seam. Those were the things he could control. Outside, a transport plane flew low, a silhouette blurring the stars. Inside the vault, the latest assembly hummed as the test bench engaged. The instruments gave a steady voice. Oil pressure steady, temperatures within limits, vibration dampers holding. The men in the workshop paused, the way people do when a familiar melody returns after long absence. The successful run was recorded, the adjustment notes filed, the engine mounted and prepared for departure at dawn. The machine would go, the plant would continue its work, and the men and women, each with their small notebooks and calloused palms, would keep asking the same questions as they had on the first night. Can we coax the metal to be honest? And if it is honest, what then will we do with that honesty? The answer, as yet, would be decided in skies far from their watchful halls. A courier arrived before daybreak with a typed order and a single line on the back that read,
Priority shipment to Nachtjagdgruppe. Deploy within 48 hours. Brandt folded the order and tucked it into his logbook, then walked to the bench where Samuel was already rating, welding helmet up, eyes bright with the cold. "We listen," Samuel said, echoing his earlier question with less mischief and more resolve. Brandt put a hand on the boy's shoulder and, for a moment, let the weight of that contact carry them both. They moved into the morning like men who had rehearsed their small human scenes for months. The factory doors opened, the engines cooled on cradles, the convoy started. The BF-110s rolled out into a dawn that had a hard light and a soft gray at once, like news that could not decide whether to be gentle or exact. There would be other tests, other nights when the metal would demand new languages, other logbook entries that doubled as confessions. The secret factory would bend and hold, produce and suffer, remember and be remembered. A place where the arc of technical craft intersected stubbornly with the moral weight of what those crafts made possible.
The story was not ended. It had gathered momentum like the long sweep of a propeller blade and would continue into missions beyond the plant, into the alteration of tactics, into the memories that survivors would carry. But for now, with the engines mounted and the men lined up, the plant breathed in unison and pushed its first freight of this batch into the morning's thin light. The road ahead was uncertain. The metal, for all its honesty that night, had not yet explained the language of consequence. The convoy thinned into the distance, and the plant's yard fell back to its measured noises, the hiss of steam, the skate of a metal cart, the distant cry of a foreman. Brandt remained at the outer rail until the last wagon rattled past the gate, as if the act of watching could keep the freight from turning into consequence. When he walked back inside the vault, the light had shifted. The cranes threw long shadows across benches he could name by scar and dent. He ran a hand along the flank of the nearest cowling, feeling the faint warmth that lingered where hands had been, and for a moment the room seemed full of things unsaid. Letters came and went in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the plant's clocks. That morning there was no letter from Marta, only the memory of the folded page and its questions. Robert's palm had finally scarred into a pale crescent where the bandages had been. He kept it wrapped in a thin cotton even when he bent over benches. Samuel moved through the rows with the steadiness of someone who had learned to let a task narrow his thoughts. He said little. When he spoke now, it was with the economy of men who had seen what a stray sentence could lead to. 3 evenings later, a truck rolled up slow and heavy, its engine a careful cough. 2 men stepped down. One was in the worn leather of a pilot who had spent months in a seat of vibration and draft, his cap held soft in his hands. He carried himself like a man who had seen the sky too close and wanted Earth to explain itself. The other was a mechanic from the unit, face tanned to a single flat tone, fingers stained with oil as if he had been dipped and left to dry. "Delivery accepted," the pilot said without preemption, speaking to Brandt as though they were both accounting for the same transaction. He had a voice that had been schooled to be controlled. There was something in it that did not bend to sentiment. They led the crate into the bench where Brandt stood.
The mechanism that had come back looked like the same creature it had been when it left. Soot marked its casing, a bent rivet as a fresh scar. But there were the signs of combat in the finer things. A nick on the oil sump like a small tooth mark. A strip of fabric caught in a cooling duct. The faint iron smell of old blood in a recess no machine should keep. Brant set his palm on the bell housing.
The man beside him did the same, and for a breath the industrial air felt like a chapel. "It kept us steady," the pilot said. He let the words sit between them. "It gave us time to pull out of a dive. We owe—" His throat worked, and he laughed in a way that was almost a small, hard thing. He lifted his cap, and from the shadow inside, Brant could see the trace of a face that no longer belonged only to a map of friends. A line across an eyebrow where shrapnel had taken a souvenir. A capped tooth of laughter gone missing. Brant thought of Marta's handwriting and of her last sentence, how she had written of children who would someday stroke a rivet, and he felt the sentence return as if illuminated from behind. The mechanic began to strip the casing with the workman's calm of someone practiced in the rituals of diagnosis. Robert moved in to help without being asked. Samuel hovered, watching the exchange like a boy watching a lesson he wanted to learn by heart. Brant stood back and let them lift components, let them lay small assemblies on cloth like relics. As they worked, the pilot talked. He did not speak in the airy abstractions of propaganda. He spoke of the night as a place with weight. He described, in the measured way of a man who had rehearsed horror into habit, the landscape beneath him as shadow and scribble. Fields folded away into black. Towns like clusters of turned coins. Searchlights writing slow, accusatory letters into the clouds. He said that sometimes the line between bomber and town was a story told for soldiers. Sometimes it was the thin mercy of altitude. Sometimes a mistake. Sometimes the cold arithmetic of orders. "We met them over the river," he said. 4 came in, low, and we were vectored by the searchlights. I saw faces in the glow. No, not faces. Windows. Fires like open mouths. The engines your men made took the strain. We did our work. We came back. Brant felt the air constrict. The bench around him felt suddenly too close to the shape of what had happened. Hands that had tightened bolts so that someone might survive, and the same hands that turned survival into an instrument for other ends. He wanted to ask how it had felt, to hear the pilot's sense of victory, but even before the thought formed, he knew the answer would sit on the edge of many things that were not words. Relief. Fatigue, the gravity of having to know one's skill had enabled. "Did you—" Brant began, and stopped. The question fractured. Would the pilot's answer change the thing of metal into something different? Or had the thing already been different for a long time? "We saw it," the pilot said gently. "A cloud of sparks below. We saw the city's lights die a little in a place." He turned that from Brant and set his gaze on the mechanic who was tightening a bolt. "We do what we're given,"
That is the truth of it.
There was a careful hardness in him, a refusal to make apologies he did not own alone. When the engine was opened fully, the small damage showed itself in private ways. A bearing pitted where grit had found it, a valve whose seat had been jarred. The mechanic worked with the even patience of men who have known that hurried hands are cruel hands. Brant watched Robert's bandaged palm move as though testing a new muscle. Samuel's eyes tracked every motion. He would later try to name each part he had seen and rehearse their fit like prayers. Night fell while the crew ate at the long table in the workshop's canteen. The pilot declined any particular cheer. He drank black coffee and stared at his fingers as if reading them. He told a story then, not of triumph, but of a small, fleeting kindness. A navigator who had kept his cigarette stub for the entire sortie because he said it would be bad luck to toss it, and who later lit it on the ground to celebrate that they had returned. It was a sweetness like a wound that had scabbed, and the men at the table laughed softly because they knew laughter was a way to keep the world at a manageable size. Brant left before the conversation ran out. He walked the perimeter of the plant, past sheds where spares were stacked in patient piles, past the glass panes that reflected a sky now deep and blank. He thought of the pilot's words, of the image of a city's lights dying, and of Marta's imagined child touching a rivet line. The images did not reconcile themselves. They simply sat beside one another and made him feel small as a bolt. A week later, there came a radio bulletin, an uncommon sort of thing, read aloud on a board in the foreman's office for those who came by to lift a finger on their day. It was minimal. A mention of a successful night engagement over the western approaches, the loss of several enemy aircraft, the gratitude of command. There were no names of towns, no tally of fires. The men in the plant read it and folded it away like another log entry. Some accepted it as weather, some received it as a flame that might or might not touch them. Samuel began to ask different questions now, new and precise. He would stand over a bench and point at a mount and say, "If the shear pin takes this load, will it break clean or tatter?" His questions were technical, but carried beneath them something broader: how a little failure could become a larger thing. Brant answered with the discipline of an engineer: load calculations, material fatigue, redundancy. And yet he found himself returning in the evenings to the pilot's phrasing: "We do what we're given." It had the ring of a prayer or a verdict. The plant's rhythm altered with winter's coming. Mornings were a quick, brittle light, and the engines would be rolled into dusk with hands numb at the forefinger. Orders came with more urgency. A higher tempo of departure meant tighter tolerances in the workshops. At night, Brant slept with the small anxiety of a man who had learned to measure consequences by waking. He dreamed sometimes of the metal in the vault, turned blank as a lake, then of that same metal hung under glass in a museum, where children traced rivet lines without knowing the warmth that had once been there. One evening, as snow began to sift thin across the yard, a telegram arrived, stamped with a different hand. A note from the squadron. The pilot had written, in an ink that trembled at the edges, that their unit had been scrambled to meet a raid that came like a black tide, and that the engine Brant's crew had tested had kept them with throttle steady when others faltered. He had enclosed a name,
a sergeant who would come in spring if his leave could be arranged, to show the men the patch he wore now and to offer thanks. Brant folded the telegram into his logbook as if it were a second skin. He looked at the faces of the men who had molded that engine into readiness. For an instant, he imagined them in the place of the pilot, hands clenched around columns of flight, eyes on the night. He did not imagine victory or loss in simple terms. He imagined only the narrow, responsible space where their work and another man's decisions met. Outside, beyond the plant's walls, a night fighter climbed on fresh wings into a sky that wanted nothing of their conversation. Inside, the plant kept its lights low and its machines steady. Brant walked the rows with a lantern and the small, attentive mind of someone deputized to listen to metal. He set his hand on a gearbox and felt the tiny heartbeat of craftsmanship, neither good nor bad in itself, only honest to the measure of work. When he left that night, the snow made a sound like a stilled applause. He carried with him the pilot's quiet gratitude and Martha's unanswered questions. He had no solution sharpened into doctrine. He had instead the old craftsman's task renewed, to keep the bolt true, to set the bearing clean, to make the engine hold. The rest, he thought, would be decided in skies he could not see. A searchlight crossed the horizon like a slow white sentence. Brant paused and watched it slide until it lost itself to cloud. In the reflection on the nearest crankcase, his face looked unfamiliar, halved by light and dark. He touched the metal once more, and, with the almost superstitious reverence of men who keep their own counsel, turned and walked home. The work continued. The world beyond the plant would keep receiving what they made. That, at least, was a thing he could measure. He would continue to measure it, bolt by bolt. He crossed the yard with the lantern at his side, the light catching on seams of metal and on his own breath. At the gate, he paused and watched a dog run ahead of its master, a thin thing that moved like a thought, and then was gone. Snow lay in the wheel ruts, and the street lamps made the drifts into pale, unsteady hills.
For a moment, the town felt like one of those engines assembled of parts that only when brought together moved with purpose. Then the town returned to itself. A shutter banged, a child called, a curtain glowed from a second-floor window. The war, living beyond any single view, as if it were a presence that altered everything and nothing at once. He found Marta waiting by the kitchen stove. She had the habit of standing with both hands on the iron lip, leaning forward as though listening for a voice that might come from the coals. The light fell across her face and left a band of shadow under her eyes. Her questions, whatever they had once been, sat in the room like a slow accumulation of ash. "You heard?" she asked, without looking up. "The telegram," Brant said. He set the lantern down and let the smell of hot broth fold the air. Marta's mouth tightened. They write, then. They remember. But they send a name to visit in spring. Spring is a long time. "Spring will come," he said. The words were not protest, so much as an observation he had learned to make of the world. Seasons arrive, whether men are ready or not. She turned and offered him a cup of tea. Her hands were rough.
The knuckles rose like the ridges on casting molds. "Samuel's been different," she said. "He asks about how things break. He says it like he is trying to predict the way a life will end." Brant thought of Samuel at his workbench, of the questions that had lately crept into quiet corners of engineering talk. He had seen that look, the sudden calculation of odds, the tiny recoil when a possible failure surfaced. "He wants certainty," Brant said. "We all want that." Marta laughed, a short, dry sound. "Certainty is a luxury for men who can count every bolt. But we count other things now. We try to count the extent to which a thing is just a thing, or whether it is a choice." He looked at her then. There were evenings when she would let the question name itself plainly. Why make tools that help others kill? She asked as if searching for absolution, not accusation. Brant had never had a ready answer for that. He had the tradesman's one. The work holds to the measure of its making. Responsibility is in the doing. But when she pressed, asking whether a man who made an engine could know what it would do in the heat of a decision, Brant could only repeat the facts he could touch. "You asked me once if people get lost inside what they build," he said. "Maybe sometimes they do. Or maybe they only see the thing before them. I cannot tell their hearts." Marta folded a rag and put it back on the table. "And if a man's heart is small as a bolt," she asked, "then what are we?" Brant did not answer. He had no theology for small hearts. He had only the practice of finishing what was before him, to true a shaft, to lap a bearing until it sang the right note.
It was not a cure for conscience, but it was an action, and actions had a way of keeping men out of despair. Winter lengthened into months that thinned light and thickened bread lines. Deliveries to the plant came on fogged mornings. Men arrived with scarves and breath that pooled and hung like small ghosts. The engines took shape under a steady routine. Now and then radios crackled with news that would color the day. Another raid, another town damaged. And the men listened as one listens to weather. When the factory received a letter from the squadron in which a pilot's trembling ink gave thanks, it moved through the place like anything else that acknowledged their work. A small nod that some friction of fate had bent in their favor. There were nights, however, when that nod seemed fragile. One morning, a lorry arrived bearing a frame that had been tested too far. Samuel's bench had held the part. The trial had shown a hairline weakness that, in the face of greater strain, might have spooled out into calamity. Brant had watched Samuel's face when the report came back from the squadron, that the particular engine they had tested had performed, but that another, in a different unit, had failed and been lost. The engineer had set the paper down as if he were handling something perfectly brittle and unnecessary. "If it had been different," Samuel said, and then stopped. He had the habit of pausing mid-sentence now, as if the next clause might be an equation he could no longer resolve. "You cannot save the world, Samuel," Brant said softly. "You only save the bolt you are holding." Samuel looked at him with a patience that bordered on pity. "You make it sound as if I want to save the world. I only wonder at how small the margin is."
At night, Brant dreamed, as he always had, of halves and whole things. Metal under glass, rivets like teeth in a jaw, men whose faces were lit by instruments rather than by daylight. He would wake and measure by the old craftsman's rules: temperature, contact, torque, and the numbers steadied him in a way that prayer used to. Perhaps for him, the world had always been a ledger to be balanced. As the year tilted toward spring, the telegram's promise of a sergeant who wished to come and thank them in person began to alter the way men walked into the shop. They straightened their jackets with small ceremonious gestures. They polished nameplates and checked oil levels twice. Pride, when it was allowed, was a private thing. Redress came from the knowledge that someone in a place beyond their sight had been held aloft by what they had done. The day the sergeant arrived was one that smelled of thaw and something like apprehension. Steam rose from the gutters, and the yard was thick with the sticky mud that would not be gone for weeks. Brant met the man at the platform, more by habit than by ceremony, with his palms rubbed raw from the winter's work.
The sergeant got down from the train in a manner that suggested a body relearned. His gait held the stiffness of one who had lived with cramped quarters and nights of alarm. He was not the young pilot whose handwriting had trembled on the telegram. He was older by a few years, perhaps, and had a ribboned stripe on his sleeve that marked him as someone who had been near the edge of things and remained. He carried no swagger. His eyes were the pale, careful kind that had catalogued too many small losses. "You, Brant?" he asked. His voice had the bluntness of a man accustomed to direct speech. "Brant of the works?" Brant nodded and offered his hand. He felt the sergeant's fingers, calloused, warm, and some small part of the world slid into a clearer gear. The sergeant did not parade gratitude. He spoke instead of a night that had bent toward them with the impatience of ocean storms. He told in brief fragments of engines flaming or failing, of a formation that had moved like a single thought, and of the pilot whose steadiness had mattered. He held out a square of cloth folded in the palm of his hand, a patch worn at the edges and still carrying the faint smell of oil and wind. "He says he would have lost it without you," the sergeant said. "Not the plane, not just that. He would have lost the man inside it. He told me to tell you that the engine was not simply metal to him. It was a promise he kept with his own hands. He asked if there were men he might thank." Brant felt, briefly, the small, dizzying lift of feeling seen. It was gratitude in its purest form, not grand, not fully explanatory, but a tether thrown between two worksites of the world. The sergeant unrolled a photograph then, grainy and dark, and there in the cockpit was the pilot whose name had been on the telegram, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He smiled in the photograph with the grudging sort of smile men give to difficult duty. "You did good," the sergeant said. "We do what we're given, and you gave them something that let them keep doing it." Marta came into the platform as the men talked. She had wrapped a scarf around her throat and held a tin of stew in one hand, as if carrying an offering. The sergeant looked at her with a soldier's recognition.
the understanding that women like her kept other fronts together. They walked back to the plant together. In the yard, the men straightened once more, pulled their caps down from the cold, and exchanged the small nods that serve for ceremonial acknowledgment in places where hollow praise is of little use. The sergeant moved through them with a kind of soft observance, touching a palm here, a shoulder there, as if wanting to translate thanks into contact that could be felt. Inside, Brant showed him the bench where the engine had been tried and then built. The sergeant watched the grooves and marks on the wood, followed a line with a thumb. "They feel like prayers," he said.
Like people carved them with something they believed in. "What would you have done if the engine failed that night?" Brant asked suddenly. The question rose from him like a test he set for himself. The sergeant's face closed for a fraction of a second. "We all would have done what we could," he said. "But that isn't the right answer. The right answer is that we depend on strange things, men, metal, luck, and then we try to live with what comes. I have seen enough. Thank you is what I have left." They spoke then of the pilot who had written, who had been taken on to other duties in the months after that night. The sergeant avoided gloating over the miracle of a single engine's endurance. He instead described the small ways a crew learns to trust an instrument, how a man will adjust his throttle by feel, or keep an engine at a note that sounds right in his bones. It was the language of intimacy between man and machine, of a quiet covenant. Marta listened and then asked the question that had lodged in Brant's evenings. "Does his thanks change anything?" she asked the sergeant. "I mean, does it make you less afraid to send them back? Does it make you sleep better?" The sergeant looked at her with an expression that was not unkind. "It does not make me believe in miracles," he said. "But it does make me believe that someone out there cares about the things we thought of as anonymous. If that matters, then yes, it changes a little. It gives me a reason to tell the men that there are faces, not only orders." Brant felt the truth of that like a weight lifted. Small, perhaps, but not negligible. There are things, he thought, that arrive in a life as thin as a telegram and change how one measures the consequence of labor. Gratitude was such a thing. The sergeant stayed for an hour, drank stew, and asked after men by name. He produced a folded letter from the pilot, the same handwriting, steadier now, and it read not in grand declarations, but in simple sentences. A pause for thanks, a memory of an engine's hum, a remark that the sky had seemed fuller because the machine had held. He left the patch with Brant and asked if he might return in a season when leave could be taken long enough for story. When he left, the men returned to work with a different gait. The machines were as they had been before. Tolerances were still calculated, and bolts were still set. But something in the way a man picked up a wrench or set his shoulder at a lathe had altered. Small, as a bend in a blade, but decisive. If before they had argued only with metal, now they argued with a memory as well. Brant found himself thinking of Marta's question about small hearts. He could not answer it finally. He had never thought himself qualified to judge the size of souls.
But he could see that gratitude, when it came, did not annul the hard facts. It only sat beside them like another tool, useful for certain tasks. The world still had its calculations and its frightened nights.
Men still woke to the press of duty on their ribs. But sometimes, he felt, a patch in a palm or a name on a telegram could reroute the weight of those nights. The sergeant's last words as he shouldered his pack were simple. Tell him the sky remembers. Tell him that his steadiness lives in someone else's hands. Brant stood at the gate after he had helped the man climb into his coach and watched the carriage rattle away. The town had its small noises, hammers, a child's laugh, a cart on stone. He thought of the pilot in his cockpit, hands at the controls, trusting a thing born of their labor. He thought of Samuel measuring the threshold at which metal would fail. He thought of Marta with the rag folded on her table and the tea left to cool. All of them, in their different ways, had stitched a net. Spring would not erase the winter's cold. There would be more nights to measure, and more telegrams, perhaps, bearing thanks or sorrow. Brant had no desire to frame the world with false certainties. He would return to the bench tomorrow, and the next day after that. He would make bolts that were true, and bearings that did not chatter. He would listen to the metal and to the men who came with questions. That, in the small jurisdiction left to him, was his answer. He walked home with the patch, a small square of worn cloth that for the moment occupied a pocket like a small, tender stone. He set it on his workbench that night, beneath the lamp's clear eye. It sat among files and calipers, a colored declaration that the narrow, responsible space where their work and another man's decisions met could be more than an administrative fact. It could be an origin for gratitude and for memory. Outside the plant, low clouds moved, and the searchlight cut a steady white arc across the yard, sweeping like a deliberate hand. Brant went to sleep with the metal of the world under the soles of his feet, and an odd peace that did not claim to be resolution. The work continued. The men kept their measure. When morning came, he would set the bolt true again, and the world, in its vast and unknowable sweep, would receive what they made. For the present, that was enough.